He spent his whole life remaining invisible to the world, day after day unchanged. Yet silence doesn't always mean surrender. It can hide a desperate dream that might still come true. Are you ready to discover where his quiet waiting will lead? Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe. It takes just a second for you but means the world to me. That autumn day, a chilly wind swept yellow leaves across the orphanage yard, and the sky hung low and gray. 6-year-old Andrew lay on a hard bed in the corner of a large dormitory room, realizing for the first time how truly alone he was. Until then, he hadn't noticed just how distant the world could feel when you have neither a home nor a family. All around him were identical metal beds, each with a thin blanket. At night, when the light from the overhead lamp dimmed, the walls seemed taller and colder. Other children cried softly into their pillows, whispering for their mothers, clutching worn-out teddy bears or battered toy cars. But Andrew had nothing to hold. No teddy bear, no toy car. His only possession was a small soldier figurine, its paint chipped and one arm broken. He found it under a cabinet in the playroom on his very first day here. It became a treasure, the only thing he could call his own, so he always gripped it tightly in his hand. Life in the orphanage was a loop of repeated routines. Early each morning, a caretaker's loud voice pulled them out of bed. They had to wash quickly in the communal bathroom and rush to the cafeteria before the porridge turned cold. After breakfast, the children split into groups. The youngest stayed indoors drawing or playing, while the older kids attended makeshift classes in another part of the building. Andrew, despite his shyness, listened to the teachers attentively. He was fascinated by the chance to learn, even if he didn't fully understand the purpose yet. Later, the children were ushered outside to play. The yard was small, with a rusty swing set and a worn-out slide that groaned louder than it could actually slide anyone down. A short, peeling fence stood around the yard, often swaying in the gusty wind. The kids made the most of these meager surroundings, inventing games, building little forts of sticks and gravel, or simply chasing one another until a sharp whistle called them back inside for dinner. Come evening, they gathered in the so-called playroom, where outdated, well-worn toys lined shelves, the remnants of other children who'd once lived here. Andrew didn't enjoy these evening gatherings, because that was when the struggles began. Squabbles over small cars, dolls, or patched-up teddy bears that might have an eye missing. He tried to keep to himself, clutching his little soldier in one hand. But one night, his fears were realized when Thomas, a boy of about 9 who always carried a rubber ball, noticed Andrew's toy. "Where'd you get that, soldier?" Thomas asked, tossing his ball lightly in one hand. "I found it," Andrew replied softly, his voice tinged with apprehension. "Let me see," Thomas insisted, reaching out a hand. Andrew's heart pounded so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. He pressed the soldier to his chest, refusing to let go. All around them, children were shouting, arguing over broken dolls and wooden trucks, but Andrew heard only the sound of his own heartbeat. "It's mine," he whispered, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the figurine. Thomas frowned, stepping closer. "Give it here." He tugged on Andrew's hand, and Andrew held on desperately, as if surrendering the soldier meant losing his only source of comfort. But Thomas was bigger and stronger. With one sharp yank, he pried the figurine away. That night, Andrew lay in bed staring at the dark ceiling. He didn't cry, tears seemed pointless. No one comforted him or offered to get his soldier back. In a place where everyone fought for scraps of comfort, he realized that having something precious also meant you could lose it. The next day, Andrew followed the daily schedule like a sleepwalker. Wake up, dress, breakfast, a bit of schooling, then outside to the yard. The sky was dull, the air heavy with the damp scent of fallen leaves. He looked across the yard and spotted Thomas near the fence, bouncing his rubber ball. Despite lingering anger and sadness, Andrew approached and sat down nearby. They both sat in silence for a moment, as if neither knew what to say. The squeaking swings and children's laughter formed a distant backdrop. Suddenly Thomas tossed his ball gently towards Andrew. "Catch," he said simply. Andrew, startled, picked up the ball. He hesitated, unsure if this was some sort of trick. But Thomas merely nodded, indicating for Andrew to throw it back. Slowly, Andrew did, feeling a warm flicker within, the smallest glow of hope. Perhaps there was a kind of connection here, even if it couldn't replace the soldier figurine he'd lost. That fleeting moment of sharing broke through his isolation. A small reminder that maybe there was still room for understanding and acceptance, even in a place where it seemed there was none. There was always a special smell lingering in the orphanage. In summer, it mingled with dusty curtains and the warmth of the wooden floorboards. In autumn, with the damp chill of wet boots and the draft from partially open windows. In winter, with the porridge they cooked for breakfast and the stuffy voices of caretakers who were often battling colds. Yet underneath these changes in season, there was one constant aroma: the smell of waiting. Andrew felt it every time he allowed himself to think about the future. Every child in that place waited for something. They waited for someone new, a man or a woman with kind eyes, to peek in through the door and quietly say, "There you are. I've been looking for you." They waited for that special moment, when someone would take them by the hand and lead them away from those gray walls. But as Andrew grew older, he began to realize that such a moment came only for some of the children, not for everyone. He saw how certain kids disappeared, leaving with adults whose eyes held a tenderness that seemed to say they already loved these children unconditionally. Usually, the smallest ones were chosen first. Grown-ups would lean over the cribs, pick up tiny babies, and smile as they carried them into a new life. Andrew noticed a particular sparkle in those adults' eyes, as if they somehow knew, "This is our child." Later on, older children were adopted too, but only those who still smiled easily, chatted without reservation, and showed genuine excitement. It was as though they hadn't yet become part of the orphanage itself. Andrew, however, seemed to merge more and more with that place year after year. He felt like he was no different from the dormitory beds, each identical and overlooked, or the doors that always creaked in the wind, or the big wooden wardrobe in the corner, unchanged for decades. By the time he turned 10, he stopped expecting anyone to come for him. He'd seen how the lucky ones left, brimming with excitement, while the rest cried or whispered desperately, "Maybe tomorrow it'll be me." Then tomorrow would arrive, and everything stayed the same. By 12, Andrew was certain he wouldn't be taken. He was too quiet, too unremarkable, unable to adapt to new people or flash bright smiles. The adults who came were searching for a child who would become part of their lives. And Andrew, well, he belonged to no one. At 15, he realized it was time to prepare for adulthood. Any dream of returning to a warm, loving home, with parents waiting inside, was pushed aside. No soft blanket, no happy voice greeting him, "I'm home." Instead, he simply awaited the day they would say, "You're old enough now, you're free." But freedom felt terrifying when you had no idea where to go or what to do. At 18, he was assigned a bed in a dormitory. He packed his worn clothes into a battered backpack, taking only a couple of books, a few photographs, and an old notebook. He had nothing else. Stepping across the threshold of a tiny room with flaking walls, he felt a painful echo of the orphanage. The same rundown beds, the same hollow sense of emptiness. Only now there were no other children, no caretakers. He was truly alone. For the first few days, he sat by the window, watching the world outside. Families walked by, parents with children, couples strolling arm in arm. They laughed, talked, and seemed so alive. Andrew felt as though he didn't exist in that world at all. No one asked about him, or so much as thought of him. Sometimes he imagined disappearing altogether, and the thought crossed his mind that it wouldn't change anything for anyone. He tried talking to the other residents of the dorm, but it was as though an invisible wall stood between him and them. They talked about their families, their younger siblings, and phone calls with their parents. Their childhoods held warmth and pleasant memories. Andrew had only the dim corridors of the orphanage in his past. Realizing how impossible that gap was to bridge, he finally stopped trying. Months turned into years, but his life followed the same loop. Work, eat, sleep, with a constant feeling that no one needed him. Days blurred into nights, while inside him stretched an endless winter where every step lost meaning. And so Andrew found himself suspended between a past he couldn't cherish and a future he couldn't imagine. It seemed as though no one would ever truly know he existed. Because when the sense of waiting disappears from an orphanage child's life, all that remains is a heavy emptiness. It trails behind you, whispering incessantly, "No one needs you." Andrew lived exactly as those who are expected by no one. No phone calls in the evenings, no morning greetings, no voices saying ordinary yet meaningful words like good morning or good night. Day after day, he rose from the bed in his featureless apartment, each corner filled with a sense of emptiness, never seeing a difference between the start of the week and its end. He had grown used to waking early, not out of desire, but because sleep no longer offered rest or fresh hopes. Once up, he routinely made coffee. He didn't truly savor its bitter taste. It was more like a small ritual that signaled the start of yet another day, reminding him he had tasks to do. He dressed, went to work, be it an office, a warehouse, or any new job he found, crossing paths with countless strangers, none of whom he remembered. In the evening, he returned to his silent room. Silence remained his constant companion. Years passed this way. By the time he was 25, he realized with sadness that he no longer believed in change. Not that he hadn't tried. He found work in different places, stores, restaurants, offices, hoping someone at work would notice him, befriend him. Occasionally people would trade a few polite words, but rarely more than small talk about the weather or tasks that needed doing. Sometimes he'd be invited to sit at a table during lunch, yet conversation would inevitably drift to others, leaving Andrew a quiet onlooker. Then each person would head off, as though forgetting he'd been there at all. He sometimes watched colleagues plan lively get-togethers, exchange gifts on holidays, or chat about weekend plans, feeling like an outsider behind a sheet of glass. It was as though he stood inside a transparent dome, hearing their voices, but never able to join in the fun. No one asked him to join them, and no one texted him after hours. Even if he failed to appear at work the next day, no one seemed to notice or question why. At 27, he started to suspect that perhaps he was the problem. He tried making small talk, forcing jokes, attempting conversations about books or films. But each word felt awkward, like a borrowed load he didn't know how to carry. People responded politely in brief, detached phrases, then turned toward someone else, someone they already knew, someone easier to talk to. And Andrew was left feeling that everything he said vanished into thin air, leaving no echo in anyone's mind. He tried to form relationships with women, going on dates, at the movies, cafes, or strolling through parks, pushing past his fear of being misunderstood. Yet he couldn't shake the sense that he was imitating someone else's life, following the right rules for a date. He didn't know how to respond to compliments or when to open up about himself, much less what details he could even share. Every touch, every glance felt off, as though he were acting in a play with unfamiliar lines. Eventually, every connection ended the same way. "You're nice, but I don't think we're a good fit." Or worse yet, total silence when the other person simply never called again. And so Andrew's life circled back to its familiar loneliness. By 30, he had resigned himself to a life without close companions. He came home, shut the door behind him, knowing no one would ask how his day went. No one would cook dinner with him. No one would turn on music in the other room. Sometimes, while grocery shopping, he noticed people around him. Young men and women debating which pasta to buy, parents patiently explaining something to their child, customers laughing into their phones. In those moments, he felt more acutely the invisible line separating him from a world where everyone was needed by someone, where people genuinely cared about one another. It seemed like a place he simply couldn't access. When the loneliness became overwhelming, Andrew tried filling his time with various activities. He bought books, opened them, read a few pages, only to realize he hadn't retained a thing. He turned on the TV and flipped channels mindlessly, just to have some background noise breaking the silence. A few times, he ventured out to a cafe on his own, ordering a cup of tea or coffee in hopes of feeling connected to the crowd around him. Instead, he saw curious or even judgmental looks, feeling suddenly exposed. An odd presence in a space typically meant for social gatherings. Eventually, he stopped going. The years slipped by, yet he never quite learned to perceive the passage of time. One day he was 25, another day he was 30, but no events stood out enough to mark those transitions in his life. He kept working, returning nightly to an empty apartment, waiting for sleep to come. Mornings were always the same. A cup of coffee, a silent commute, another day spent among people he barely knew, followed by that same door closing behind him in the evening, sealing him in silence. Sometimes he wondered, if I disappeared, would anyone notice? The answer was always the same. Probably not. His workplace would hire someone new. His apartment would be rented to another tenant. No one would be shocked to learn Andrew was gone, because in truth, he'd never really been there for anyone in the first place. That realization was perhaps the most frightening of all, living among so many people, yet remaining completely invisible, as if he never existed. Andrew never thought there would be room for dreams in his life. When you've spent your whole existence learning not to expect anything good, when no one ever chooses you, when no one holds your hand, and your room is nothing more than a place to spend the night, dreams become a luxury. Yet one day, as he stood in front of a playground, he suddenly realized he'd always dreamed of having a family. It went back to his childhood, to the moments he sat quietly in a corner watching other children get taken home. He remembered the hushed whispers from those kids who said they now had a mom and dad, a new room of their own, favorite foods waiting in a real kitchen. He remembered the days when others drove off to begin new lives, leaving him behind to wonder why he was never chosen. Back then, he desperately wanted someone to say, "Andrew, come on, we're going home," and to feel that he belonged somewhere, that someone was waiting for him. But he learned not to speak of these hopes. The more you want something, the more it hurts when you can't have it. Years passed. Life carried on, each day drifting into the next, and loneliness became a habit. Occasionally, Andrew would pause by a playground just to watch. He'd stand there with his hands in his pockets as children rushed around, shouting and laughing, building sandcastles or arguing over whose ball flew farther. Nearby, parents supervised, mothers adjusting their children's hats, fathers showing them how to throw a ball or ride a bike. Once, Andrew saw a father lift a little girl into the air, and she burst into ringing laughter. At that moment, Andrew felt a physical ache inside, a sort of emptiness that had always been with him but now seemed bigger than ever, because he knew he would never hold his own child and hear that kind of laughter. He loved children but had no clue how to talk about it. After all, who was he? A solitary man with no family, no friends, and not even the faintest link to anyone else in the world. He had no one to confide in about this longing. If he told someone, "I've always wanted to be a father," he imagined he'd get only awkward silence in return. People like him weren't supposed to say such things aloud. Sometimes he let his mind wander. What if he found someone? What if he had a home? What if, waking up in the morning, he heard not just the kettle's whistle but also soft footsteps near the door? What if he could wrap his hand around a tiny one? What if he heard a child call him Dad? He didn't know where this dream came from. He'd never seen a real family from the inside, yet he longed for one as desperately as a man thirsts for air. But families weren't for people like him, he told himself. More years slid by. He got older and nothing changed. He still passed playgrounds on his way home. He still saw other people's families. He still said nothing, carrying the same lump in his throat that never went away. One day in a store, he noticed a woman with her young son, perhaps 4 years old, tugging on her sleeve and pointing to a chocolate bar. "But we already have sweets at home," she said with a smile. "But this is different," the child insisted. Andrew couldn't look away. Even such a simple exchange, so ordinary for other people, was something he would never experience. Later, he sat in a cafe by the window, ordering coffee he didn't drink, merely staring out at the rain trickling down the glass. He knew it was time to accept reality, to stop dwelling on what would never happen. But he couldn't. That night, he dreamed he wasn't alone. He walked down a street with someone. hand in hand laughing together. He felt a gaze full of warmth, the way people look at those dearest to them. Waking up, he sat upright in bed, sweating and disoriented, only to find nothing but darkness and silence. No one was there, just as always and just as it would always be. Outside the window, he heard the muffled laughter of a child at a late hour, probably a family who had somewhere to return to. Andrew sat on the edge of his bed, covering his face with his hands, wanting to banish the thoughts, wanting not to feel that ache. Some things, though, can't be ripped from the heart. He would forever glance at other people's families and feel that gaping void inside him. He'd always yearned for something he could never have, and in the end, knowing that was worse than loneliness itself. Time slipped by without Andrew really noticing. He moved from one job to the next, paid rent, bought groceries, warmed up leftovers in the microwave, and then suddenly he was 40. 40 years old. Back when he was a kid, that number felt distant and almost unreal. He used to think that by 40, he'd have a home, a family, the everyday concerns of an adult life, discussing utility bills, complaining about traffic, offering advice to children. But now, gazing at his reflection, he saw the same lonely boy from the orphanage, only with gray at his temples. The world might have moved on, yet he scarcely felt its flow. There was work, there was sleep, there was money deposited into his bank account, only to be spent on whatever he needed to get by. He hardly knew which day of the week it was anymore. Monday felt like Thursday and Saturday felt like Tuesday. The calendar changed on the wall, but nothing changed within him. His coworkers no longer asked questions. At 25, they used to wonder, "Are you seeing anyone? What do you do for fun? Got any hobbies?" But they soon realized he didn't have answers. Conversations with him eventually whittled down to work-related matters. He could go a whole day in the office without speaking a single word. There was no one to text on his lunch break, no one to call in the evening, and no one who would call him. He felt he'd become a person people simply overlooked. One day he overheard a hallway conversation. A few employees were planning a fishing trip. "This time let's stay 3 days," someone said. "I'll bring the tent and boat. The air's so clean there." "Sounds great," agreed another. "Shall we make a list of who's going?" Andrew paused. Fishing. He'd never been, not because he wasn't interested, but because he had nobody to go with. In his younger days, he'd watched groups of men gather, talking about gear, showing off pictures of their catches. He had none of those snapshots. He didn't have a friend to ask, "Want to go fishing together?" He listened to his coworkers laugh as they mapped out their trip, and a familiar tightness seized his chest. No one thought to invite him. He was just a figure passing by, someone who didn't belong in their plans. Sometimes he wondered how it happened that at 40, he still had no close relationships at all. After all, he'd spent years among people, working, living in a city full of opportunities. Yet he never became someone people remembered, someone they could imagine sharing a weekend with. Later that night, he was sitting in a cafe, and at the next table 3 men were animatedly discussing their upcoming fishing trip. "This time we should bring more gear. Definitely, we didn't have enough last time. And we'll cook something over the fire too." Andrew stared into his coffee. He thought of how much he wanted to know what it was like. Sitting around a campfire, laughing and trading stories, or simply being able to sit in companionable silence while gazing at the water. But he had no one to do that with. Sighing, he finished his coffee and went home. The years kept slipping by, yet he felt none of them. He merely existed. Watching others commute home, laughing or arguing, talking on their phones, he thought, perhaps I was born for this, to be alone. He picked up his bag and trudged back to his empty apartment, where the only certainty was the monotony awaiting him behind its silent door. Loneliness doesn't always manifest as empty evenings or aimless walks. Sometimes it arrives quietly but ruthlessly, exactly when you need help the most, and there's no one to turn to. Andrew had never been one to complain, though. He was used to doing everything himself. Shopping for groceries, hauling heavy bags, cooking, cleaning his apartment, paying bills. He knew that if he didn't do it, no one else would. Yet over the years, even the simplest tasks grew harder. His body no longer had the ease it did at 20. He noticed how each passing year made it harder to leave the house, how he'd linger on the couch before mustering the will to stand. He felt exhausted, but there was no one to say, "Rest. Let me help you." One day he fell ill with a cold. It seemed minor, yet when you live alone, being sick becomes a different kind of ordeal. There's no one to buy medicine, no one to bring hot tea, no one to murmur, "You'll be all right." Andrew lay in bed, wrapped in blankets, aching with fever and a scratchy throat, lacking even the strength to get up for a glass of water. He stared at the ceiling, remembering how, as a child in the orphanage, the caretakers looked after him whenever he felt unwell. Other kids might sit nearby chatting away, making his discomfort seem a little less scary. Now it was just him, only silence and an empty room. If his condition worsened, no one would ever know. No one would even guess he was sick. After a long struggle, he forced himself to stand. His legs felt like rubber, his vision swayed, but he had to at least reach the kitchen. Slowly, step by step, he made it, poured a glass of water with trembling hands and took small sips. How ridiculous to feel such relief at a simple drink of water. But when you're alone, even that can become a challenge. It was then he wondered, what if I got worse? What if I literally couldn't get up? Would anyone notice? When? How many days would pass before somebody realized I never left my apartment? A week? A month? That thought frightened him. Yet what scared him more was when he broke his leg. It happened on his way home from work one winter evening. The sidewalk was slick with ice, and in one misstep, the ground vanished under him. Pain shot through his leg, and for a moment he was paralyzed, unable to move. When he tried to stand, his leg wouldn't cooperate. Each attempt sent fresh stabs of pain. People walked by, some casting glances in his direction, but nobody stopped or offered a hand. For a while he just sat on the cold pavement, wondering what to do. As a child, if someone fell, another child would fetch a caretaker. If someone cried, a friend would comfort them. Now no one came. No one asked, "Are you all right?" It was as though he was invisible, unneeded. He reached the hospital on his own, filled out the paperwork himself, listened as the doctor explained he'd need bed rest and help with day-to-day tasks. Help? From whom? Andrew thought. The doctor mentioned relatives who should watch him to make sure he didn't put pressure on the leg. Andrew nearly said, "I have no one," but stayed silent. How could he explain what it's like to live in a world where you truly have no one? It was terribly hard. Simple chores became torture. He couldn't cook a proper meal or leave the house. Bathing proved worst of all. He tried leaning on his good leg, bracing himself against the wall, but at some point he slipped. He ended up on the shower floor, hot water pounding down on him, his chest heaving with something warm and awful. It wasn't anger, not resentment. It was pure, absolute loneliness. The physical pain from his broken leg paled beside the realization that he was utterly alone. No one would help. No one would ever know he was there, needing assistance, exhausted by everything. For a while he just lay under the spray. Then, clenching his teeth, he pushed himself upright, reached for the wall, finally managed to stand. He shut off the water, wrapped a towel around himself, hobbled to the bed and lay down. Not because he was tired, he simply no longer wanted to move. He wished he could disappear. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, recalling his childhood days at the orphanage and the windows he'd gaze out of, hoping someone would come for him. No one ever did. And now, all these years later, nothing had changed. He was still alone in the darkness, realizing that in this world, he had only himself, and it would never be any different. Andrew sat by the window as though waiting for some miraculous event. Days could pass, yet he hardly changed his posture, slumped in his worn armchair that had long since become his refuge. In truth, there was no one he expected to see. The habit of gazing at the world outside lingered from those years when he still believed someone might come, take him by the hand and say, "Let's go home." Now he was old. Time had sketched deep lines on his face, and what remained of his hair had turned gray and thin. The world on the other side of the window was full of life. People rushing along sidewalks, talking, laughing. Parents held their children's hands, men and women walked side by side. Andrew watched it all yet felt it belonged to someone else's reality. Once he too hurried along these very streets, commuting to work, paying rent, saving up for small comforts. But the years had slipped away, and now his existence boiled down to a single cramped room. He kept a kettle around to boil water once a day, but he no longer saw the point in using it more often. A well-worn calendar hung on the wall, but he had stopped paying attention to the dates. His body constantly reminded him of his age. Joints ached in bad weather, and every movement pulled at muscles he'd hardly used in months. More than the fear of getting old, he was terrified of growing old alone. No friends, no relatives, no voices urging him to rest or offering help with simple tasks. Time had lost its meaning. Mornings, afternoons, and evenings all blurred together in a single endless stretch. Andrew rose, drank some water, sat by the window, then later lay down again. He barely noticed whether it was Monday or Saturday, winter or autumn. When you have no one to talk to and nothing that depends on your presence, time becomes empty. He sometimes imagined how things might be if he had just one person who would check on him, who might say, "Let's go for a walk," or simply, "How are you?" But it never happened. And now in his 70s he knew it never would. One day he felt especially weary, though not in pain, just overcome by a heavy fatigue in his bones, a kind of numbness. He sank into the armchair, shut his eyes and thought, "This is it. This is how it ends." Not in some bustling hospital ward or a crowd of relatives whispering last words, but here in silence, in a rundown chair by the window. Another day no different from all the others. He recalled being a little boy at the orphanage, the moment he realized nobody would take him home. He remembered himself at 20, renting his first room and wondering if he'd ever fill it with warmth. He pictured himself at 30, realizing he had no close friends or family. At 40, accepting that nothing had changed and likely never would. And now in his 70s he was still alone. Beyond the glass, a woman held the hand of a small child, saying something that made the little one burst into laughter. Andrew felt a sharp pang in his chest, a reminder that his home was devoid of such sounds. No footprints in the hallway, no lingering evidence of other lives. Only him, his chair, and an unbreakable silence that had accompanied him for as long as he could remember. He knew this was how things would be. He'd known it all his life. Yet somehow, facing the end, he found it more frightening than ever. Closing his eyes, he whispered softly, "Andrew, let's go home." No one answered. Andrew woke that morning with a strange sense that something was amiss. He felt no sharp pain, no overwhelming weakness, only the faint awareness that something had shifted. He lay still for a while, staring at the ceiling. There had been a time when he believed he still had the luxury of someday. He had hoped that one day he'd find someone, start a family, learn to love and be loved, learn how to truly live. But now he was over 80 and it was too late. He'd simply existed while life passed him by. Slowly, he moved to his chair by the window. His hands trembled slightly. He gazed outside. Children were racing along the sidewalk, shouting and laughing, bumping into each other. A young couple walked by, hand in hand, smiling at something the other had said. A man carried home a loaf of bread while a woman spoke to him, beaming. Andrew realized their lives would be vastly different from his. They would love, make mistakes, laugh, cry, but all the while they would have each other. He had never known that. Now he never would. In his youth he'd thought there was still so much time. He believed he could eventually meet a friend, find a partner, raise a family, come home to someone who cared. But the years came and went and he did nothing. He postponed action, waiting for everything to somehow fall into place on its own. He went on living, yet never really lived. He remembered himself at 20, renting his first tiny room, confident that his entire future lay ahead and that he could afford to wait. He remembered turning 30, busy with work, wandering city streets alone, eating solo in cafes. Back then he sometimes told himself, "I'm sure I'll have a family one day." At 40 he realized nothing had changed and felt it was too late to start one. By then, he'd resigned himself to solitude. And there he was at 50, long past hoping or expecting anything else. Just existing day by day. Now at over 80, he finally faced a truth he'd avoided all his life. He no longer had time. He let out a heavy sigh, his hands weak in his lap. He knew he would soon close his eyes for the last time, and there would be only silence. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of never having truly lived. All these years he had assumed there would be a choice. But in the end, his inaction had made the choice for him. Life is not just what happens to you, it's what you create. If you do nothing, it slips past while you wait. Looking out the window once more, he remembered how he'd spent his life hoping someone would find him, say, "I need you." Only now at the last moment did he understand. No one ever finds you unless you step forward first. Unless you tell people you need them, speak up, open your heart. He had never done that. He had waited, and his time had run out. He longed to return to his younger self and say, "Don't be afraid to talk to people." To his 20-year-old self, "Don't postpone, go out and try." To his 30-year-old self, "Don't give in, it's still not too late." To his 40-year-old self. But he could only say it to himself now, at 80. And it was far too late. He felt his body grow heavy, his eyes closing of their own accord, life drifting away as quietly as it had passed him by. No goodbyes, no last words. His final thought was not one of fear but of those still living, those who still had time to change things. If he could speak to them, he would say, "Don't wait. Don't put it off. Don't stay silent. Don't be afraid." Life slips away, and at the end all that remains is what you did or failed to do. He drew in a breath, then exhaled. He did not open his eyes again. Subscribe to the channel, and hit the like button, so you don't miss more heartwarming stories.